Hi, my name's Daniel Sitaras, and I'll be reviewing the paper Changing Geographic Distribution of Human Pathogens. Now, really at its basis, this paper is an overview, a kind of historical overview of pathogens and how there's been losses of them, how they've had rises, how they've kind of had global impacts, and how they've evolved, and how this ties into human impacts. And the reason behind that is, well, pathogens can exploit almost any change in human ecology. And think about that, it makes sense. Viruses, bacteria, microorganisms, they have vast populations and they also have short life cycles. So, in a matter of days or weeks, they're having the generations that would take, what, years, decades, centuries for most organisms to have that impact. So, they're being able to come into these new or altered landscapes from humans and really get a foothold before any other organism that will be introduced. Now, in the beginning, we look at some of the first infections of humans, or the nematode roundworm. These are found in fossilized human feces from 30,000 years ago. These were found in France and come from a human ingesting the worm's eggs. Now, farther back in Africa and the Near East areas, 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, leprosy was found, and this was kind of the beginning of human movement, migrations, and settlements. So these large groups of people coming together for the first time and bringing these infectious disease, and that's when they're being really able to run rampant. Now, other diseases, however, have been associated kind of with the dawn of man, and so 150,000 years ago. And mainly these are ones that are in the DNA genome, so sexually or vertically, father to son, mother to daughter transmitted disease. Now, one of these, the JC virus, is also used as a biological marker because these are found at the oldest remains of humans in Africa, and also of the two distinct kind of migrations of these people out of Africa. They carry two different lineages of the viruses, so they're able to track them and their kind of impact. Now, old world versus new world, that has a tie on a lot of things, including pathogens. Now, when they're talking about the 25 major human diseases of today, 18 of those have probable old world origins. So that's things like cholera, AIDS, typhoid fever, sleeping sickness, mumps, measles. Those all have old world origins. Now, there's a couple of new world origins as well. The Chagas disease, it's usually tropical or subtropical origins, kind of Caribbean area. And then there's also like syphilis, tuberculosis, where we aren't quite sure where or when their origin was. Now, a lot of things are associated also with the first human settlements, so the rise of agriculture and animal domestication. We stopped living this nomadic lifestyle and constantly moving, and kind of started sitting down, getting in the soil and the water, get localized pathogens there. Evolution of these animal pathogens from the fact that they were coming now in contact with humans on a daily basis. And so these pathogens that maybe once didn't infect humans were now evolving too, or sometimes it could just be spillover just for the fact that humans hadn't been really in enough contact with them. Some things such as reservoir hosts also applies, so rats, mice, mosquitoes, and these things that can carry these disease and then infect it. And so now that people were living in such close quarters to these animals, they're being infected as well. And this is also seen, measles and mumps. They're believed to be kind of emerging at this time period. Now, the second real big emergence would be associated with the age of exploration. And so that collapse of distance and really isolation over the past 500 years has changed the kind of homogenization of pathogens on the global scale. So we have a couple examples. King Charles VIII, when his troops went into Italy they brought syphilis, and so that became a global pandemic because of them bringing that in there. Hong Kong infected Hawaii with the bubonic plague, kind of the same way. Zanzibar was infected with cholera from East Indian trading ships. So these were bringing cargo, stopped there, and 70,000 people in Zanzibar were killed by cholera as a result. So, and you can look back at these old world meeting new world islands meeting, the mainland. There's countless examples of this happening. Now, post 1900, with really the rise in preventative care, public health, these kind of diseases have really gone down, and we've also realized that there's there's bacteria everywhere. 10 to the 31st virus species on Earth is what's believed. That was of a study done in 2001, and new human pathogens are being discovered at a rate of 3 species a year, and that was since 1980. It was discovered that we're discovering these at a rate of 3 species a year, and these are new human pathogens. So, but as of right now, there are 1,415 species that are known to be human pathogens. 538 of those are bacteria, as you can see. Also, 307 fungi, viruses. Those are kind of the main ones. Now, this brings us to the receding versus emerging. So, these emerging infectious diseases, those are diseases that either the incidence, outbreaks, the impact, maybe they're infecting people worse than they have previously, or changes maybe in geographic or the host range. And of the identified human pathogens, 13% of those are considered to be emerging now, and this has increased significantly in recent years. And so if we look at it, species richness, you have at the equator, you have the most, and then it gets less and less and less as you got to the poles. Well, that makes sense if you look at it. Warmer temperatures, more rainfall at the equator, and getting less as you go out to the poles. And that's going to really affect especially organisms, but especially pathogens, ones that need a host. It's a lot easier to live and survive outside of a host in a warm, humid environment than a very cold and potentially dry environment. However, the emerging pathogens, they are not based on this latitudinal. They have higher reports in developed countries, and so that could be a different couple reasons. Maybe the reporting efforts are better in developed nations, which are usually in these temperate areas, and also drug-resistant pathogens. They're emerging there because of these antibiotics, and now they're evolving, and so that's another reason why maybe they're not based on this. Also, pathogens on islands, as we talked earlier, a large island is going to have more species richness than a small one, and continents can have even more than that. And with human movement, we've homogenized that, but still, there are still some islands where it is more localized, and pathogens that are non-human don't need a human host to complete their life cycle. That's far more localized still. That could be another reason for why it doesn't follow along with that biogeography. Now, we're going to look at the drivers of what's driving these human pathogens, what's kind of making them either recede or emerge. And the paper breaks it down into the top 10 drivers, and that is done by the number of species that are associated with each driver. So the number 1, changes in land, all the way down to climate change. Now the paper talks about climate change and saying that it's a little controversial, that they aren't going to really get into it, but there's no denying that climate change is a driver of pathogens, especially, making, as we talked about, a humid, temperate, warm environment. That's going to breed a lot of pathogen viruses, bacteria. And so if the world's getting warmer and more humid, it's going to be more area for them to really emerge. Trade, travel, transport, that's a big one because once again we're talking about the islands, the end to natural isolation. So these pathogens now weren't on this one island, but at a global scale. And so, new host species, a bigger population, and new regions. Um, Now, looking at the pathogen loss and gains, species have been lost at unprecedented rates, and they blame that on climate change, human impacts, deforestation, but that is being reversed for the infectious disease, and so there's a couple factors on why increased movement of human populations, increased livestock and poultry production, increased trade and transport. So cities, they're going to be a big breeding area for pathogens. It's also going to be a homogenization area for pathogens because it's people of different cultures bringing in different foods, bringing in different trade, transport, livestock, poultry being in these warehouse, small areas. They're passing diseases back and forth to each other. Now, land use change, that's another big effect, but it does have more effect on bacteria than on viruses. The reason being, bacteria that changes really, they're more dependent on a certain environment or maybe a really specific temperature for them to reproduce. Viruses, not as much. And also, this is a combination of environmental and ecological issues that are leading to this. And they talk about an example of that is these fruit bats. So these fruit bats, they had a virus that it was a natural reservoir for them, but this virus got amplified when the fruit bats came in contact with these domesticated pigs, and then it ended up spilling over into the humans who were, messing with these pigs on a daily basis. And so these fruit bats that were never really coming in contact with humans or at an amount that they would actually infect them, then when they were, because of deforestation, they were being more contact with these pigs, and thus the pigs were actually infecting them. Now, biological diversity, now they gave this as a driver, but the debate still, they aren't sure if there's a relationship. And it might explain, these emerging events, low biological diversity, but also there's research that shows the opposite, that shows a lot of biological diversity is actually going to be bad for the pathogens and kind of does this dilution effect that they can't really infect everything. So, not quite sure why they have that as a driver because they don't really give much to support it as one afterwards. Pathogen evolution, this is bringing back this emergence. Primates, they've contributed to 20% of the human pathogens, although, their population size is so small because they're close to us. They've been able to kind of have these pathogens maybe be just a reservoir that it doesn't really affect them, but then it affects humans when we come in contact with them. Also, antibiotics, resistance, that's also another big part of evolution. Human population size and density, as we were talking once again about the cities, there are these things, critical community size. Typical is 200,000 to 500,000, and that would be to sustain a pathogen. Now, it can be as low as 50,000, and a lot of sick or elderly or maybe young individuals. But this human population density is actually the single best predictor of pathogen emergence or reemergence. And so, in conclusion, there's really three timeless actions that humans do. It's the magnitude, diversity of their landscape changes. It's the change in contact rates with wildlife and domestic animals at both the local and the global scale, and national variation in public health practice. And these three things are what affect pathogens' rise, loss, and evolution the most. So looking at these, we can really figure out how to protect ourselves in the future. And so that's looking at equal consideration of pathogen loss. These drivers, really identifying each driver, finding out why it does, and then figuring out how to stop that in the future. Helping out developing countries, because people in developing countries are at the greatest risk. And how really this geographic distribution, why it's not having an effect on the emerging pathogen, or is it having an effect and it's just the data that's skewed? And really, what lessons can we learn from other sciences like conservation biology or environmental science, and how they talk about species extinction, what drives that, and kind of be able to incorporate that in pathogens. Well, thank you. It was a really interesting paper. Had a lot of good points and gave a lot of great history. I would fully recommend everyone to read it. But thanks again. My name's Daniel Sitaras, and this was my paper on the changes in the global distribution of human pathogens. Thank you.